In this lesson, we will add a player to our game, and we'll add the player movement so that when we touch the screen, the player moves. How is that gonna work? If we touch on this side of the screen, it will move to the left, and if we touch on the right side of the screen, it will move to the right. So there's not gonna be on-screen controls. It'll just work wherever that you touch, it will move to one way or the other. So we've already loaded our player image. And what we need to do now is create a sprite. This.player will be equal to this.add.sprite, and then it will start in the center. This.game.world.centerx, and then also on Y it's gonna start pretty much at the end, but we'll give it we'll give it 50 pixels from the bottom. World.height -50, and the key is player. So this should be already showing a spaceship over there. Now the anchor point of the player, this.player.anchor, will be in the middle, set to 0.5. Let's enable physics on this player. Physics.arcade.enable this.player. So now the player will have the ability to collide with other elements. We don't want our player to leave the screen when we're moving either to the left or to the right, so I'm going to make sure that it touches the edges of the screen. Player.body. Body is the physical representation of the player sprite. Check collide world bounds will be set to true. So now the player cannot leave the edges. Now on update is where we want to check whether the user is pressing on the screen or not, and we also want to set the speed of the player to 0 so that the speed of the player is 0, and if the user is pressing, then it will move a little bit, but at all times the speed will be 0. So for example, if I touch, the player will start moving this way, and if I release the touch, I don't want the player to keep on moving that way forever until it hits the edge, but instead I want it to stop as soon as I lift my finger. So we'll set the speed to 0 at all times. This player.body velocity.x equals 0, and now I'm gonna listen for when the user touches the screen. So there is a concept called the active pointer. When you're touching on the game, there is an active pointer that is active, that is down. So I have to listen for that. So if this.game.input.active pointer is down, so if the user is touching the screen, then I want to set the velocity of the player to one side over the other, depending on the location of this touch. So I can get that easily. Let's call that target X. That's the X where the user is pressing. It will be this.game.input.active pointer .position.x. That will give me the X position of the touch. So if that touch is on this half of the screen, then move this way. If the touch is on the other half of the screen, then move to the right. So let's carry out that check. And we can get that, we can put that in a variable direction. So if target equals, it's greater or equal than the center of the world, then if that's true, then direction will be 1, and if that's false, direction will be -1. What I'm doing here is called a ternary operator in JavaScript, which is when you put a condition, if this condition is true, then the value of the variable will be this. If the condition is false, then will be this. You can also do this with an if statement, but this is an easy way to do it. So this is called a ternary operator, a ternary operation. Now that we have that sorted, we will set the player's velocity according to the direction. So the velocity on x will be direction times this.player speed. Example, if the direction of the player is on this half, then it will be 1. So the velocity that is already 200 will be 200. If we were on this side of the screen, the direction will have a value of -1. So the velocity at the end will be -200. Let's test that, see if it works. So if I touch here, you see that it's moving that way. If I touch here, it's moving this way. And the way to play is that you'll have your fingers on both sides. You'll have your thumbs on both sides. And as you press it, it will move one way or the other. So we've implemented now player and player movement. To summarize, all we did was create a sprite. We enabled physics so that we can have velocities and collisions and all those things. We make it so the player cannot leave the screen. It collides with the world bounds. Then on update, I'm listening for if the user is pressing on the screen, and if they are, then we get the coordinate of that touch, and according to that we give it one direction or the other. And then at all times we're setting the velocity to 0, because otherwise if I touched, like let me show you what happens if I don't do this. So if I don't do this and then I touch here, the player will just keep on moving that way, and if I touch here, it'll move that way all the way to the end. So we don't want that, therefore we set the velocity to 0. And that's how we've implemented our player.